real parents, real stories. It's the Meet the Parents podcast.
Good evening and welcome to the Meet the Parents podcast. We're here to brighten up your day with another half hour or so of chat from some of the UK's best parent bloggers. This week I'm joined by Vicky from Verily Victoria Vocalisers. Try saying that 3 times fast. Good evening, Vicky.
Hi, Tim.
Now, without getting into specific numbers, you and I are, how do I put this, 2 of the more mature members of the podcast crew, at least in terms of those pesky dates that are written on our birth certificates. Now,
absolutely. Not necessarily mentally there, though.
Oh, absolutely not. But we're both children of the 80s and late 70s, and I think it's fair to say that the world is a very different place for our kids now than it was when you and I were growing up. So, for instance, if you go back 30 years to 1986, this was the year of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, Prince Andrew's wedding to Sarah Ferguson, Diego Maradona's infamous Hand of God, and the official opening of the world's biggest car park, also known as the M25. It was also the year in which Lady Gaga and Rafael Nadal were born. The best-selling single of the year in the UK was the Communards' Don't Leave Me This Way, and Madonna's True Blue was the year's best-selling album. And on Christmas Day 1986, 30 million people watched Dirty Den serve Angie Watts with divorce papers on EastEnders, the most watched episode of any drama series in British TV history. Good God, I feel old. So
do I.
It seems like only yesterday. So anyway, this week Vicky and I are going to take a stroll down memory lane to talk about childhood then versus childhood now. So, I mentioned EastEnders just now, so let's kick off with the subject of TV, and specifically children's TV. Now, today our kids can watch children's programmes pretty much 24/7 if they wanted to. You know, in addition to what they can see on terrestrial TV, there are 35 dedicated kids channels on Sky, plus a plethora of on-demand content that can be found on YouTube and, you know, Netflix and the like. You know, it's a far cry from what we grew up with. When I was a kid, children's programmes were on for half an hour at lunchtime and a couple of hours after school.
Our kids don't know they're born, do they?
I know, they don't know how lucky they are. So Vicky, Grace is, she's 9 now, isn't she?
Yes, she is, yeah. Her favourite programmes growing up, well, when she was very small, she'd watch things like Balamori and In the Night Garden. Actually, at quite an early age, she gave up on CBeebies, which I was quite grateful for, to be honest, and moved on to CBBC quite quickly. She used to watch a lot of films, things like The Old Charlie and the Chocolate Factory with Gene Wilder. I didn't babyfy things. Yeah, her favourite programmes. She used to actually like Doctor Who when she was about 3 or 4.
We were a CBeebies household for years. And in fact, it's only really relatively recently that the boys, at least, have started to move on to slightly older stuff. And Horrid Henry's probably the boys' favourite at the moment. And then things like Danger Mouse. And Cara, I guess she watches a lot of what the boys watch. But she does like more girly stuff. So, you know, she'll watch Angelina, Paw Patrol. Kids' TV now is quite different to what it was when we were growing up, doesn't it? So how does what Grace watches compare to what you watched at her age? You know, can you remember the sort of programmes that you did watch?
My mum used to tell me that I cried when the Magic Roundabout finished. They used to be my favourite characters. And I used to watch things like Finger Bobs and Bagpuss, Ivor the Engine. Actually, since then, I've showed Grace Bagpuss and she took quite an interest in it. Danger Mouse, as you mentioned, is back on. I haven't seen the new version. I think Grace has, though, and she does talk about it.
When I was younger, I grew up with a lot of the kids' TV classics, you know, some of which you've mentioned. And, you know, I always think of things like Mr. Ben and Captain Pugwash and Charlton and the Wheelies and all that other stuff. And I remember, I remember watching Grange Hill from the very beginning. And, I mean, you know, you name it, I watched it. You know, we've been talking about Danger Mouse, but there's a lot of classic shows that have been remade over the last couple of years, haven't there? Because there's a new version of The Clangers, and then a show that's very close to my heart, you know, Thunderbirds. So with our kids, they all three of them watch both Danger Mouse and Thunderbirds, and actually all five of us often watch them together as a family. In the cases of both those two shows, the new shows have provided the opportunity to introduce the kids to the original shows too. So we've kind of watched the two side by side. And I'll tell you what, when you watch the old and the new versions together, it's amazing actually how different they are. So if you take Thunderbirds, for example, they squeeze more plot into a 22-minute story than the original did in episodes twice that length. And that's not to say the kids don't enjoy watching the originals every now and then, despite the slower pace, because actually they do. But you know, they particularly notice the obvious difference between the new versions and the old ones. And I think from a parent's perspective, the other thing that's really obvious to me is how much more politically correct and educationally worthy modern TV programs are. So you go back to the original Thunderbirds, and it was actually quite shocking because you see the characters smoking openly, and the Tracy family's manservant and his daughter were both Oriental, and you just wouldn't go anywhere near that now.
No.
It just made me think, when I grew up, we thought nothing of watching classic cartoons like Tom and Jerry, where the two main characters basically spend their entire time knocking seven bells out of each other with knives, mallets, and all manner of dangerous implements. And again, you just couldn't make a program like that anymore, could you?
Well, unless it's The Simpsons and Itchy and Scratchy, in which case, yeah. But they obviously are taking the mickey out of that. I think you're right. I think they've had to sort of smarten up their act a lot. And like you say, when you were kids, you didn't blink an eye at things like that. It was just normal.
A lot of children's programs these days have much more obvious and overt educational content, which is a good thing. But I guess sometimes it almost becomes, almost formulaic in that they have to have those kind of positive teaching moments, and they're less anarchic in a way that actually the old things like the old Danger Mouse were, because that was, to me, particularly watching it back now as an adult, that was almost like a cross between The Goodies and Monty Python in terms of some of the humour, which was actually really adult in terms of its content, which as an 8 or 9-year-old watching it first time round went completely over my head. But you watch it as an adult and go, oh yeah, I get that now. And actually the new one, that really stands out for me because they have kept that slightly anarchic sense of humour, and that's quite interesting, and in some ways I guess quite refreshing.
I mean, it's a bit like Disney, isn't it? They do that. They put the adult content in, which goes over the children's heads, but still makes it enjoyable for the grown-ups.
So I suppose the big question is children's TV now better or worse than it was when we were kids?
That's an interesting question. I feel, personally, that it's just different. And what I feel that it is a shame is that there isn't a special time of day where you can go and watch your programmes. I mean, I'd come in from school, my telly would go on from 4 o'clock, which had the kiddified stuff at the very beginning when I came from school. And as you mentioned earlier, I watched Grange Hill right from the start, and I religiously watched it every week. And about sort of 20 to 6, the telly would go off because there wouldn't be any more kids' TV. So you'd have to go out and go off and do your homework or play with your brothers and sisters or play in your room, whatever it was. I think it's a shame now. The thing I don't think is lacking, I think there's too much. And I think there's too much of it being on 24/7. I just don't think it makes it special anymore.
The whole idea of appointment TV, where the entire family would sit down to watch a programme at an appointed time, and then you'd go into school or into work the following morning and you'd all talk about it because you'd all seen it at the same time. Whereas these days we're just watching stuff live, we're watching it days or weeks or possibly even months after, and you don't get that same kind of the idea of the water cooler moment anymore. And that, I think you're right, that is a bit of a shame now. I guess our overall verdict is TV better, or is children's TV better now or in the past? Maybe not so much one way or the other, but it's certainly different. Now I'm just going to go off and watch Rhubarb and Custard on DVD. So we've just talked about TV, and moving on, Vicky, I think you wanted to talk a little bit more about what else we used to do with our time indoors at a time when, as kids, we didn't have all the computers and Xboxes and iPads and all the other stuff to play with.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, actually. I mean, back in our day, we didn't have the continuous computer games, iPads, phones or anything like that. And, I've tried to show Grace vinyl records and all this type of thing. And she sort of looks at me as if I'm a bit of an idiot. But I do think it's a shame that a lot of children these days just seem to be stuck in front of computer games or video games or their computers. And I can remember when I was a child, I'm the eldest of 7 kids, so I had a choice of people to play with. But there was a lot more things like drawing. I'd go and cook and do baking with my mum. I know a lot of kids still do that, but I find that the art of conversation isn't as good as it used to be. You know, we've just started playing things like categories with Grace, because I just think that family time should be that. When you come home of an evening, everybody scatters off doing their own thing, and half the time, and that happens in this house, I'm on my computer, Ross is on his, and Grace is actually in her room playing. Now, she's 9, and I still haven't allowed her own computer. She doesn't have a television in her room. She doesn't have a phone. I want her to still be a kid for a bit longer. I think the first computer game I had was something called Frogger. That's what I had. I mean, what sort of thing did you have as a child? Did you have anything like that?
I have to admit, I did play quite a lot of computer games. Now, we had one of those old Atari games consoles.
Oh, yeah.
So the ones where you played games like Pac-Man and Missile Command and Asteroids and all that stuff that's really, really popular again now with this whole retro gaming craze. And then I also used to have a Spectrum and a Commodore 64. That was the time when we were all trying to learn how to program in languages like BASIC. I was a bit of a geek, but actually I used to read a lot as well. So again, a bit of a geek, but both a digital one and an analog one.
I think that's a good mixture to have, actually. I was very similar. We used to have a Commodore 64. I remember my first game was Ghostbusters. And the amount of times I'd try and load it and it would just crash on me. And eventually, you'd load up and just have fun with it. But you had to be so patient. And again, it comes back to this attention span. But the other thing I'd always get when I was a child was a magazine. And it was Smash Hits, without fail. And I can remember from about the age of 8 learning the lyrics each week to the songs that were in the charts. I loved Smash Hits, and I'd get number 1 magazine and just 17, even though I was nowhere near 17. In actual fact, I can remember my mum buying me things like Jackie, where they had the picture strips of stories where girlfriend and boyfriend would split up with each other.
Yeah, I remember buying Smash Hits as well, and before that I remember getting, what was it called? It was
Was it Lookin'?
That was it, yes, exactly, Lookin'. That used to have all the comic strips of TV shows and things like that. And it's funny, I mean, our kids have inherited a love of magazines as well, partly because I've encouraged them to do that, but they get occasional magazines of their favourite TV shows. So we were talking about Thunderbirds earlier. The kids get the monthly Thunderbirds magazine with that, although to call it a magazine is perhaps stretching the definition of the word a little bit. It's actually just a toy with a magazine attached.
That's the trouble with magazines as well, isn't it? I mean, every single one has what they call a free toy, which is not really free because actually the price of the magazine is hideous. Grace is a member of the RSPCA club, so she gets a magazine delivered from them, I think every other month or something like that. But she's just recently taken an interest in a magazine called Girls Talk, which is aimed at girls her age, and they get freebies on the front, but they're not too much. But inside, actually, I've had a look at the magazine. She's actually got it for the second week running this week. And it's really quite engaging. They do word searches and quizzes and interesting information, facts and stuff. And actually, I don't mind that she sits and reads that. She's reading as well. She's reading her David Walliams book. I'm quite pleased that she hasn't got lost in computer games. If she wants to play a computer game, she has to come into the lounge with us, and generally it's with Ross who's playing something.
So what other sorts of games did you used to play as a child, and do you find that you're now doing something very similar with Grace?
I can remember as a child playing games, things like horses out in the garden. I had space hoppers, and we'd pretend they were horses and jump over jumps and ride around the garden on our space hoppers. I mean, we just make up games in the house and, play mum and dads with our dolls, or mums and pick up our dolls and pretend to be mums. Grace does that, though. I mean, she's got a baby Annabelle, she's got her Bratz dolls, she's got her Barbies, and she'll make up different games at different times depending on what she feels like. And it's great to see that even though there's no one else to play with, she still has this imaginative playtime in her room with her own toys.
One of the things I find with our kids, and that I love about the fact that we have 3 of them, is that they do a lot of of interactive role-playing and type stuff together, and sometimes they're just imitating stuff that they've seen on TV, and other times they're just being much more creative. And you give them things like an old cardboard box, and they love things like that because it just gives them license to do whatever they want with their imagination. And I think it's great when kids have the opportunity to use their imagination like that.
I mean, and another thing I have to come to as well is if you go to restaurants, I've never sort of taken iPads and stuff. I know a lot of people do that, but I would like Grace to either sit and colour the thing that they give out, which she does, and she does word searches now, or sit and have a chat with us.
We've kind of come through that phase where we always used to take things like iPads and phones with us to restaurants as a last resort. And we were always quite keen to ensure that it never became something that they expected, but only something that they were allowed to have maybe, later in the meal when you're waiting for the bill and so on, and you give them the iPad or the phone for 5 minutes rather than being something that you just give them up front. Because you're right, because otherwise you lose that opportunity to talk and to interact as a family. And you talked about losing the art of conversation earlier, and I think that's really sad when that happens. And that's very easy to happen when you just allow kids to involve themselves in their own world with a game and an iPad and so on. What we're finding now that they're a little bit older is that they've almost come out the other side of that. And now that, Isaac's 8, Carver's almost 4, and that expectation to just go straight to an electronic device isn't there. In fact, the one person who's most guilty of that is probably me.
Yeah, I'm the same.
Does the pace of modern life get you down? Need to get away from the constant emails and notifications? But you can't afford a Gear VR or an Oculus Rift virtual reality headset? Then slip on the latest in high-tech, low-cost eyewear that will help you escape the stresses and strains of today and bask in nostalgic memories of your youth. These tinted glasses will allow you to focus on the good old days and ignore all the negative aspects of the past. Lenses come in only one colour, rose. Rose-tinted glasses are not guaranteed to give an accurate view of history.
So we've just talked about what we used to do indoors. Now, let's move on and talk a little bit about what we used to do outdoors. Now, one refrain I often hear from people of a similar age to me is how we always used to spend our days during the school holidays playing outside all day, having adventures with our friends, with only an instruction to be home in time for tea to answer to. And in fact, if you believe some accounts, summers were basically just the real life Swallows and Amazons and Famous Five. Now, I don't know about you, Vicky, but I'm not entirely sure that was actually the case. I certainly wasn't allowed any further than the end of our street before I was secondary school age, and I can remember being maybe 7 years old and being allowed to play with kids on the street. We lived in a quiet cul-de-sac initially, without being supervised by adults, and that probably wouldn't happen now, would it?
I don't think it would. It would actually, and it's interesting you say that because I was very similar. We were only allowed up as far as the lamppost in our street and back again, and we'd ride out on our bikes and come back. Now, I wouldn't dare let Grace do that out on our road now. And we used to live in a cul-de-sac as well. And there were a couple of families with children older than us. And we'd sometimes go off and play with them. And my mum would never come out and supervise and see where we were. And I do feel that I don't know whether it was safe then. It's really strange, isn't it? Because I just wouldn't allow it now. And I just wonder if the world has become a more closed-in place. I think it's because we're more aware of it because of things like the news on all the time. And maybe we just are overprotective, but I just don't know.
Yeah, it's funny. I definitely think that we're much more aware and vigilant about, the potential perils of modern life than we used to be. And we had an incident locally just last week where someone, thankfully unsuccessfully, tried to snatch an 8-year-old from a park. And these days, something like this happens and it's all over Facebook, it's all over the media, and these things come out into the open much more quickly in a way perhaps they didn't when we were kids. And maybe maybe things were a little bit more different then. Maybe we were just a little bit more trusting and naive. I can't imagine letting our kids beyond the end of the road now, and we now live in a quiet cul-de-sac in the middle of an estate where nobody comes. So they're as safe in our road as they're ever going to be.
It's interesting. I mean, we live in a small close of just 4 houses, and there's diagonally opposite us, the couple there look after their grandchild on a regular basis, and he must be about, I'd say, 6 or 7, and he rides his bike round and round our close, but it's only very small. So the chances of anything happening would be, nothing really. But we were walking down the end of the road yesterday to go to the shops, and Ross, Grace and I were crossing quite a busy main road. And there were 2 children opposite us coming the other way to come across the road. And they probably were a bit younger than Grace, and they were on their own. And Ross and I then had a discussion after we'd crossed the road and said, would you let Grace out do that? And I was like, no, would you? And he was like, no. And we were quite shocked. And I think, though, back in our day, it would have been the norm.
If you go back to our childhoods, can you remember at what age you were allowed to venture out on your own during the day?
Yeah, I mean, I must have been about 7 or 8. But I just think there was less cars then too. The roads weren't as busy. People weren't in a rush all the time.
Yeah, and I think I must have been similar. I certainly remember being allowed out to play in the street with the neighbours' kids when I was about 7. And then that changed a little bit because we moved from a cul-de-sac to living in a house on a fairly busy main road, so I wasn't allowed out on my own on the street then. And actually, to be fair, there wasn't the opportunity to just play out on the streets in the way that there was in our previous house. But I remember the first time I went home from school on my own was aged 10, and I remember that being a big thing because I had to walk a certain distance from the school to catch a train, and then from the train station to go home. And at 10, that felt almost quite big and scary. But I don't remember being left out to wander around on my own all day until I moved to secondary school.
Yeah, I think I was about the same actually. And actually, when we moved when I was 10, we moved to a more rural area where trying to get anywhere was a long walk to a bus stop over quite a narrow bridge and an unrestricted road. So my mum obviously didn't allow us to do that because it was just too dangerous. But it's quite interesting looking back and seeing the differences between areas, and I think that's partly what it comes down to, is where you live.
Yeah, that's right. I guess if you're in a busy town or on a busy street, you're going to be slightly more cautious about letting your kids out. Having lived in London growing up, it certainly wasn't until I was 12 or so that I was allowed out, to any great extent. But Isaac's 8, and he's very responsible for his age. But we wouldn't dream of letting him go off even on his bike into town, which is only half a mile down the road. We wouldn't imagine letting him do that for probably at least a couple of years yet. And I guess from the sounds of it, you're quite similar with Grace in terms of allowing her that kind of freedom.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, she starts a new school in September, and it is closer than the one she's at now. And I know quite a few of the children who go there walk there, and she's wanting to do the same. I don't think she will do it first, but I don't mind the fact that a few of them will walk together. I mean, I know there's a couple of children in her class in quite close vicinity to our house, and they'll probably all meet up and walk together, which is fine with me because as far as I'm concerned, if there's more of them, I think it's much safer. But yeah, I mean, even that sort of makes me feel a bit,
Yeah, so I guess kind of wrapping this up, do kids have less freedom to play outside than they used to? Is the world a more dangerous place? Maybe, but perhaps not quite as much as our slightly warped memories of the past might have us believe. So it's certainly different for our kids, isn't it? But maybe it's not quite as different as perhaps sometimes it's made out to be. So for our final discussion, you and I both love our music. Those of you with good memories will remember that Vicky has talked about the 80s duo Go West in previous podcasts. So let's compare music then with music now.
When I come from, an era, and I'm sure you're the same, Tim, where Sunday night was chart night. My father would put the stereo on, set up the tape player and put it on record pause and be ready to record each and every song that came up, press pause for the DJ bit in the middle, and then unpause it again for the next song.
And you'd sit there cursing every time they talked over an intro or an outro.
Yes, it's like, don't do it! I think the thing is then, I mean, obviously we didn't have things like Pop Idol or Britain's Got Talent and all this stuff, and X Factor. A lot of the music that came about was stuff that was, singer-songwriter music. And I preferred that era. I'm going to sound really old now when I say all this. And also the other thing my dad was a big lover of music, and so was my mum actually, but my dad was the one on a Sunday who we'd have the doors open to the garden. He'd put things like ELO on, Queen, Jethro Tull, and my mum loved things like Crystal Gale, and she loved Krista Berg and people like that. And so there was a very big mixture of lots of different things. And whenever we went on holiday, we'd always have specific songs played in the car, but they were never sort of kids' songs or nursery rhymes. Because there were so many of us and we were all different ages, we'd try and find something that we could all listen to. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, now that sounds very similar to my upbringing. Now, I mean, all my musical influences come from my dad rather than from both my parents. But growing up, we used to listen to everything from, Elvis and, country music influences such as, you mentioned Crystal Gale, absolutely, Tammy Wynette, all those great artists from the 70s. And then, all the way through kind of mainstream pop to even to punk. Okay, maybe a bit less punk because I think I was only 7 at the time that the Sex Pistols were at their peak. But, I was exposed to all manner of music. So music has always been a massive part of my life growing up. I guess that gets passed on to our own kids, doesn't it?
I think so, yeah. I mean, when I was a child, one of the other things that would happen is my uncles ran a disco. And obviously it was vinyl, 7-inch singles. And I'd go over, because they lived with my granddad, I'd go over to his house and they'd have all their disco set up. And every time I went there, I'd thumb through the top 10 of that week and ask him to put stuff on. And they used to record tapes for me as well, which I used to dance to in the garden. And now Grace gets tapes or CDs recorded, and she's got a little iPod that she has. And Ross is constantly downloading music for her, but she's got such a huge variety of taste. I mean, she'll listen to anything sort of really heavy metal, rock, and also, I can't even remember the names of the groups off the top of my head. She listens to Wrestlers music, obviously, because Ross loves that. She says to me when she goes away, there's 2 things that remind her of us. And one of the things she always thinks about is Go West. I mean, as I've said before in a previous podcast, she was born to their music. And in the car, I never used to play nursery rhymes. It would always be a variety of different songs. The only thing that disappoints me now is how much more explicit things are. With some of the songs, you have to make sure. I mean, one of the things she loves is Macklemore, and there's Thrift Shop and Downtown. And we have to make sure we've got the clean versions. And I think it's such a shame that you have to do that.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? I mean, these days, it becomes the first thing you do, doesn't it, to check whether you're downloading a clean version and just to make sure that the lyrics are acceptable for a child of a certain age. And I mean, I remember I go back to 1984, it was, wasn't it? And the furore that was kicked up over Frankie Goes to Hollywood and Relax.
I was going to say, I know what you're going to talk about there, yeah.
And that was an incredibly rare and exceptional example of explicit lyrics. But now everyone is dropping explicit lyrics or suggestive lyrics, whether it's obvious examples like Robin Thicke's Blurred Lines or Rihanna to even much more mainstream child-friendly artists, Maroon 5, Katy Perry. It's everywhere. And it's not just lyrics as well, is it? You see it in videos as well.
Yeah, I mean, I just think some videos are so unnecessary. And you used a classic example there of Robin Thicke. And I don't know if you've seen the actual version, the original version of his video. And I just thought, oh my God, what are you doing? I was really shocked. And I just thought, no, this isn't acceptable, actually. You've gone beyond the boundaries of what should and shouldn't happen. And maybe I do sound like a prude, but I think music should be something that's accessible to everybody. They shouldn't turn it into some sort of soft porn thing.
Yeah, and there is a real double standard now, isn't there? Because it's particularly obvious when it comes to female artists. So, you look at, we mentioned Rihanna and Katy Perry, but, Britney Spears, the list goes on and on, doesn't it? I mean, pop stars these days would seem underdressed even for the beach.
Yeah, I mean, Ross actually, funny enough, recently mentioned one of the first times his eyes popped out of his head, and it was Sabrina's Boys, Boys, Boys video. Yeah. And, that now would look completely, utterly acceptable compared to what they do these days.
it would look positively tame, wouldn't it? It's funny what you say about Grace having a broad range of musical tastes. I find with our kids, I think they have some kind of inbuilt sensor or alert which kind of flags up the moment a song comes on the radio that predates 2008 or so, because they just kind of turn up their noses and go, "No, that's old and rubbish, Dad." My kids are always complaining that the default radio station in my car is absolute 80s. I am basically just stuck in a time warp. So what do you think these days when you hear stuff that's in the charts?
Grace and I actually, for quite a long time, would religiously put on a music channel in the morning and find some good stuff. And there wasn't that much, but we like things like Nick Jonas. He had a song called Levels Out. Grace and I loved that. Stitches, recently, I can't remember the artist off the top of my head, but you know, we enjoyed that. I'm very open-minded when it comes to songs and music. You know, I'll listen to anything, and as long as it's a good tune and good lyrics, then I'm happy. It doesn't matter if it's an artist who is from the 80s or from the current day. I'm happy as long as it's a good tune.
Yeah, I find I'm the same. I try to be much more open-minded, although I have certainly found the last 3, 4, 5 years that I'm much less aware of what's in the top 10 or the top 40 these days than I used to be. So anyway, that's our views on modern music. Basically, it's not all just noise to us, but we do like our classic 80s. So Vicky and I are now off to go and put on an old Go West CD. So before we wrap up, anything else new and exciting that's been happening recently in your world?
Actually, I've been sort of making my diet much cleaner for our next attempt when we finally get round to going back for our egg donation treatment. And I've been testing out a really good, and I'm not saying this because I want to promote them in any way, although I've done a review on my blog, a really good recipe box service, and they do organic food and it's gluten-free, and they're called Mindful Chef. And I have to say, it's taken so much work out of my week. It's brilliant. And I'm really enjoying testing that out. It's been really good. And then in a couple of weeks, it looks like Ross, Grace and I are off to Ireland for a press trip. So, it's going to be exciting. We hopefully are going to be visiting some of the locations for Game of Thrones.
Ah, excellent. So as for me, at the time of recording this podcast, I am officially between jobs. I closed down my final project and packed up my desk on Friday afternoon, and I'll be starting my new job as of next week. So scared, a little, excited, definitely. And that's it for this episode of the Meet the Parents podcast. We'll be back again next week, but in the meantime, here's where you can find the two of us online.
I'm at Verily Victoria Vocalises. The URL is www.vevivos.com, and I'm on Twitter at Vic Welton.
And I'm at slouchingtowardsthatcham.com, and you can find me on Twitter at ThatchamDad. Now you can download this podcast on iTunes and on Android devices, on our website at meettheparentspodcast.com, and via a variety of podcasting apps. And do please give us a follow on Twitter at ParentsPodcast and Facebook at facebook.com/meettheparentspodcast. And don't forget to vote for all your favourite bloggers in the Bib Awards. So thank you for listening, and do please join us again next week. Good night.